Chapter 17 The Final Dakota Roundup. That spring, we'd received orders from the Morris Company to clean up their range early that year. When I returned, we started gathering for the big shipment. They wanted their 95,000 head rounded up by December, which meant lots of work ahead. The last story to tell about my Dakota days involved the Negro cook, Charlie. We were camped in the middle of the Badlands near a waterhole. Charlie found a bunch of young mallard ducks and caught a dozen of them more. We all enjoyed our dinner of fried duck and gravy. The weather was being hot and sultry, and since prospects for a thunderstorm were good, we all discussed it over dinner. I told Charlie that if it began to thunder, to unhitch the team, for they would run away with him. Remembering another bad storm he had witnessed, he said, "Sure enough, Captain, I'll do that, sure thing." Along about 3:30 that evening, the horses were shut from the view of the dark clouds that were hung over us. Deafening peals of thunder and blinding flashes of lightning made all of us a bit uneasy. The wagon had just left the noon camp when the clouds blackened. I rode to give Charlie another warning. He assured me that he would do as ordered. Before I again reached the herd, the clouds burst forth with all their fury. The herd stampeded the bunch of steers that were gathering almost at the same time. We had our hands full keeping them from mixing and scattering to the four winds. Just as we got the herd under control, someone yelled, "Look out!" I looked and saw the lead team from the chuck wagon coming directly toward the herd, bringing their double trees with them. I knew Charlie had to let them get away, so taking down my catch rope, I made a dash to head them off. As I came within reach, I roped the lead horse and brought them all to a halt. Then I unhitched the traces. I had to call the boys to help me. We soon found the wagon on ditch, at least part of it. The front wheels and the wheel team were gone. Charlie was under the back end of the wagon, bareheaded, hunkered down on his knees, calling, "Lord, for God's sake, help!" When he saw me, he started to jump up and butted the bottom of the wagon bed and grabbed the wagon wheel with both hands and shook it. He was so scared and comical that I doubled up with laughter. Then I got out of humor with him. The team had broken the coupling pole in the wagon and run off with the front wheels. We had to get the wheel horses and fix up the broken coupling pole before we could move the wagon. That poor Negro was always getting scared and getting into trouble some way. I told him to get on my horse and drive up the horses one day. He got on my horse but failed to keep his seat. He went straight up into the air and came down on his head. I asked him if he got hurt, and he said, "Nah, sir, I just lit up right top of my head." He grinned. "It never hurt me none." He was always wanting to help with the cattle and getting in the way. One day I turned a steer loose on him. I had the steer roped from my hind leg and had the Negro hold his head. It was a 3-year-old black steer, and the boys had tailed him down and branded him. When I turned him loose, he took right after Charlie. Across the prairie they went. Charlie had his cap in his hand and his head thrown back and his mouth wide open, with that old steer sniffling at his heels every jump for about 50 yards. When the steer's head went between the Negro's legs, he gave him a toss that sent him back over the animal's back. Charlie measured his 6'6" upon the ground. The steer turned him, and he just lay there upon his back and yelled and kicked the steer for a few seconds. The steer would turn him over once in a while. The Negro's number 12 shoes was landing pretty often in the steer's nose and bringing the blood every time. The steer seemed to be getting the worst end of the fight, so I ran over and roped him. Charlie made a run for the wagon and did not stop until he had climbed on top of the chuck box, the highest place he can find. When I got the steer loose, I rode back to the wagon and said, "Charlie, that steer didn't scare you, did it?" He said, "No, sir. He didn't exactly scare me, but he might be after a while, Captain, if you hadn't caught him. I was just fooling along and let him catch me. I wanted just to kick him a little." But that was the last steer I'll bet the Negro went around. Well, I'd made up my mind that when the train left the C7 stock, Byrd would be on it for Texas. I had had enough of the cowboy life in that bad Dakota weather, but I was leaving behind some happy memories and some very sorrowful ones. I worked long and hard during those last winter months of shipping. I left only a few cattle scattered here and there, but to be shipped by Mr. Hardy later on. I'd turned in my resignation and was to meet Mr. Morris and Mr. Hardy in Chicago so they could go over my books. Mr. Hardy and Mr. Morris went over my books and were pleased. The book showed how many cattle had been placed on the ranch in that year and the number shipped to market. It showed the number of cows branded of both sexes and the number butchered on the ranch for beef. It showed the tons of hay put up and the expense fencing and general labor, groceries, and horse feed. I had had to give an account of every penny. It had been a big job tending the books and rounding up that many cattle. Remember, I said the books were accurate, not that they showed a big profit. Mr. Morris told me they were going to close out the Dakota ranch the next year. He was making plans then, perhaps, to stock the one in Old Mexico. I believe the ranch he had there was called the Terrar. I left Mr. and Mrs. Hardy about 5 the next evening, never to see them again. When Mr. Hardy passed away, he was buried in Morristown. When she died in 1955, his body was moved to Hewlett and placed beside hers in the Moore Hill Cemetery. Maybe those were, after all, the good old days. After I bought my ticket and checked my baggage in Vernon, Texas, I had 30 minutes to wait for the train to Kansas City. I walked on from the depot about 3 blocks, and then suddenly I was standing in the corner of a dark alley in the red light district watching the lights of the boats as they glided along the waters of the Mississippi River. I'd been there about 2 minutes when a cab drawn by 2 horses with a driver in the seat on top whirled past me and turned into the dark alley. I heard a woman scream. The cab came to a halt about 30 yards from where I stood. A man got out carrying her in his arms and a coat wrapped around her head. I rushed to the door, but found it locked. I went around the corner and turned to the dimly lit street and down the opposite of the basement in the back of the building. I found a stairway entering a room filled with girls dressed in tights and other scanty attire. Many hard-looking men were there, too. I made my way to the back, which was partitioned off by a plank wall. The first hall led into another hall going the opposite direction. Everything was still. I turned to my right and walked to the end of the hall, then turned and started the other way, stepped as light as I could on my riding boots. I heard the woman scream again. I ran to the door and hid it, but found it locked. I banged on the door and backed across the hall with my gun in hand and waited. The man yelled, "Who are you? What the hell do you want here?" Just then a bullet came through the door and struck right above my head. I put a bullet through the lock on the door and struck with all my strength. The door came open, and I found myself in the middle of a matchbox room. It contained a bed, a dresser, a chair or two. I pressed my trigger again, and my bullet hit the man in the arm. I had purposely only wounded him. He fled, holding his bleeding arm. "Let's get out of here fast," I told the young girl. I could hear people running down the hall. I had to do a bit of ducking and dodging, but we made it to the street. She jumped into a cab in one direction and headed out for the depot. As I sat in the train looking out the window at the relief of the dim lights, I breathed a sigh of relief. Goodbye, Chicago and Dakota. I bid you adieu. I may go to hell, but never back to you. There could be no other explanation about the girl other than she was being forced into the business of prostitution.